I'm very happy to be here for more than one reason, which is that a lot of the battles, caste battles that I recorded in this book on the basis of archival evidence revolves around the Malabar area. You know that when it comes to the issue of untouchability, there were restrictions on members of that oppressed community, both in the secular sphere and sacred sphere, that is in temples, right? In both these aspects, Malabar played a very pivotal role. And as it happens, when it comes to the battles that were fought on the secular front, meaning access to basic amenities like, say, roads, water bodies, marketplace, schools, right? So when it comes to this, a place that Mr. Jose mentioned from my book when he was summarizing it, in fact I thought he was preempting some of the things I meant to tell you. Kalpati, which is not very far from here, which is in Palakkad, an Agraharam in Palakkad, was a big battlefield. And only this morning, Mr. Haridas did me the favor of taking me there. And it was exciting to see that place because it reminded me of all the battles that were fought there. And I also saw that Rath, the chariot, which was on display near the temple, that had a crucial role to play in this whole battle. But unfortunately, there was no reference anywhere of the battle itself that I was talking about in my book. This happened in the year 1924. That is exactly 100 years ago. And as a matter of fact, did I say 1984? I said 1924. And 1924 was packed with a lot of reforms relating to providing access to untouchables, to various, basic amenities. This was inspired by something that happened the previous year, that is in 1923 in Bombay Presidency. You might have heard of S.K. Bole, Bole Resolution. That formed the basis on which Ambedkar organized the first major, satyagraha in 1927, right? Now, soon after the Bole Resolution took place, and much before Ambedkar undertook this mass agitation in, Mahad. This Mahad was what? It was about testing the resolution, the Bole Resolution on the ground. That Bole Resolution was about providing access to Dalits to these basic amenities, and that included water bodies. So he took his followers to a lake in Mahad in order to do what? Just to be able to drink water from there. And that was cause enough for dominant Hindu castes of that area to take offense and resort to violence. Now that happened in 27. Now, way before that, in Madras, what happened was inspired by Bole Resolution. There was a resolution similar to that was passed in the Madras Presidency. And why do I talk about Madras Presidency when I'm sitting here in Kerala? It's because this part of Madras Presidency, no, not this part, the Malabar part, this was still in Cochin, right? If you go slightly to the north, Palakkad and all those areas, they all came in the Malabar district and they were part of the Madras Presidency. So, this Srinivasan, whose full name is Rettamalai Srinivasan, I don't know if any of you find the name familiar. He was the man who accompanied Ambedkar to the Roundtable Conference that took place in 1930-31. There were two Dalit members who represented Dalits in that conference, and one of them was Srinivasan. So in 1924, inspired by the Bole Resolution, he was instrumental in a similar resolution being passed in Madras Presidency. And that was followed up a month later by the Madras Presidency with a GO number 2660. Now, why do I mention that? Because that was the equivalent of, for the Madras Presidency, that was the equivalent of, say, the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln in United States. Because it was talking about equality. I'm happy to be speaking on the platform of Samadarshi. Samadarshi means looking at everybody with equality, right? So that resolution of Srinivasan of 1924, that is exactly 100 years ago, in August 1984 it was passed. And then in September 1984, the Madras government came up with a resolution, with a GO called 2660, which, makes that into a law. It was binding on everybody to implement it, because now it's coming as a GO, right? Now, that inspired in turn an Edava leader of Malabar region, that is one advocate called Raghavan, to test that resolution in Malabar area, in particular in Kalpati. Why? What was that he had in his mind? Every year, and that's the practice even now, from November 13th to 15th, they would have a very famous Rathotsavam there in Kalpati. You might be familiar with that. So he said, okay, just now that resolution was passed and then this GO was passed. So this is the first opportunity for us to test it. So he informs the local administration that he intends to carry a certain number of members of his community, Edava community, to that Agraharam. Now Agraharam was considered an area that was out of bounds for lower castes. Why? Because their very presence on the road would be contaminating to the upper caste people, to the Brahmins who live in that area. That was the notion that they suffered from. As a result of that, when Raghavan took his followers to that Rathotsavam, which started on November 13, 1924, there was a very strong pushback against it, and it took the form of violence. And then after that, the British administration imposes prohibitory orders and takes action against who? Not against the culprits who precipitated that violence. Instead, action was taken against these members of the Edava community for disrupting the status quo. So there was something that created a lot of tension, because from the same government there was an order to the effect that untouchables could not be stopped from walking on any street or accessing any of these basic amenities in the secular sphere, right? And yet, when leader of an Edava community, I may clarify here that at that time Edavas were treated as untouchables, which is the reason why at the same time in the Travancore area, there was another agitation going on, led by Edavas. What was that? The Vaikom Satyagraha. That was also happening around the same time, 1924-25, right? So, Edavas were asserting their rights to equality in the same year in two different parts of modern Kerala. One in the Travancore area, that is Vaikom, and that was also to do what? Not to enter a temple, which is a secular space. It was only to be able to allow to walk on the streets leading to the Shiva temple in Vaikom. There was something known as Tindal. So there were these Tindal Palakas, which were like those notorious boards that were put in certain clubs in British India, which said, Indians and dogs not allowed. So this was something like that. Board put by the Travancore administration saying that members of the untouchable communities, including Edavas, were not allowed. So this, this tussle in Kalpati, the violence that followed, and the injustice that was perpetrated by both the upper caste elements and also the colonial government, which was being wishy-washy. On the one hand, after Srinivasan passes that resolution, they pass a GO. And then on the other hand, when the Brahmin elements who are very influential push back and resort to violence, they don't take action against that. So that prompted one very assertive, one very combative, but unfortunately unknown legislator in the Madras Legislative Council to attempt something unheard of, something inconceivable in those circumstances. What am I referring to? A legislation. You know, after this Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919, and in fact even prior to that, you know, there was already in earlier part of 1919, the then governor of Madras, Willingdon, did something extraordinary. That is, for the first time ever anywhere in British India, he appointed, or rather he nominated an untouchable to the Legislative Council, and that was M.C. Raja. And that was a bit of a revolutionary step, because what it meant was that a member of an untouchable community could then suddenly sit at a high table along with caste Hindus and British administrators and be treated as an equal and be addressed like anybody else as honorable member. I mean, imagine what kind of a civilizational breakthrough that Willingdon made. And remember, he made this on his own, because it was not as if Congress, which was leading the freedom struggle, or even Justice Party, which went on to pioneer some social justice measures in Madras presidency, had asked for this kind of reform. Their concerns were far from, the plight of untouchables. They were fighting for their own benefits. I mean, in the case of Congress, it was for political emancipation, and in the case of Justice Party, they were focused on the more influential non-Brahmins at that time, right? So this was something that Willingdon himself came up with, and he adopted the nomination route for that, recognizing the fact that that sliver of Indian elite that constituted the electorate were unlikely to elect an untouchable to the legislature. So the only way untouchables would have been able to have a voice in the legislative forum was through the nomination route. And this was a measure, this was an innovation that a British administrator did on his own. I mean, I'm emphasizing on that because we are so accustomed to this nationalist narrative, which tends to be too black and white, which overlooks the fact that there were two kinds of struggles that were going on: political struggle and social struggle. Now, our historians, nationalist historians, tend to focus on the political struggle because the villain, the culprit in the context of political struggle is a white man, a foreigner. But when it comes to the social struggle, who is the oppressor? It is our own people. It is the elite of our own society, right? So they found that inconvenient, and this aspect was glossed over. As a result, a book that I did as a mere journalist in 2023, a few months ago, is the very first one to mention one extraordinary feat pulled off by this legislator I mentioned a while ago, that is Veerayan, following the violence at Kalpati, not very far from where we are speaking. So what did he do? He drafted and piloted and mobilized support against all odds for the first ever legislation anywhere in the country against untouchability. This is such an extraordinary feat. I mean, just for the fact that that was the first ever legislation against untouchability is something that should have been celebrated and recorded in our history. All the more so because it was something that was pulled off by a Dalit, by an untouchable. So that makes it all the more heroic, all the more a reason for us to celebrate. And yet, you won't find it anywhere in our history books. Why? Because, as I said, we were our historians, nationalist historians were far too focused on the political struggle, and they ignored such stirring, inspiring events in our history. And those events still are very relevant to today's India because those battles are still unresolved. They still relate to today's fault lines, and yet we know nothing about it. So this bill was introduced by him in the wake of Kalpati, and it was finally passed in 1926. It's called Madras Local Bodies Amendment Bill. Now, this is also a civilizational breakthrough. Why? Because a way of life for caste Hindus, particularly Brahmins, was, a religiously sanctioned way of life, which they have had for centuries. What is it? That, there is this acharam, which meant that if you are an untouchable, especially in the south, as you know, in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, it was not just untouchability. You had something known as unapproachability, unseeability. If in the rest of the country, contact was a cause for pollution, here proximity also was polluting. And if you were a member of a lower community, you have to maintain this much distance from a Nambudri. If you are a Nair, this much. If you are an Edava, this much. Or if you are a Pulaya, even further, depending on the status of that caste in the hierarchy, right? So it was in such a context that somebody like, there was a bit of dialectics at work here, because South was the worst when it came to untouchability. This might sound very surprising because today southern states are counted among the most progressive states. If they are progressive, it is perhaps because they were among the worst in the country when it came to caste oppression. So there were a lot of battles therefore fought against it, and that led to reforms like this. So the first ever legislation is very important for us to know, because as I said, it was a civilizational breakthrough. It turned a way of life, a sacred way of life for Brahmins, the most influential caste at the time, into a penalty, into an offense. Imagine how important that idea was. And it was a baby step. He couldn't go too far. It was very radical in itself. So all that he could come up with was, if an untouchable is barred from entering a road, then the culprit will be imposed a penalty of a fine, monetary penalty. It did not entail imprisonment. That came much later. But this was the beginning. And the importance of this can also be appreciated by the fact that this is something that a mere Dalit legislator, it's a private member bill in modern parlance, against all odds he pulled it off. A dozen years later, when in that same province, that is Madras Presidency, post 1935 Act, when Congress comes to power for the first time, and Rajaji, no less than Gandhi's chief lieutenant on matters relating to caste, he becomes at that time the designation was premier. He becomes the premier of Madras Presidency. What is the law he comes up with? He had so much more power than, say, Veerayan had. Veerayan, despite being just a private member, and that too of the untouchable community, he had the audacity to propose, and he succeeded in this kind of legislative acknowledgement of the fact that this sacred way of life for Brahmins, what is a sacred way of life for Brahmins, is a punitive offense. If they bar anybody from entering a public space or accessing a water body and so on, right? So, if he could do that, what did Rajaji do? Rajaji came up with one very mild legislation which does not define any offense at all relating to untouchability. It merely says that no court will recognize any custom that upholds untouchability, that perpetuates untouchability. It doesn't say what would happen if somebody commits an act of untouchability. There's no offense defined, much less is there any penalty prescribed. So it was just a declaratory law. So that puts in perspective that makes Veerayan's achievement all the more remarkable. And yet we know nothing about it. This is the first book that brought out Veerayan's great achievement. Now, this is as far as reforms relating to secular space was concerned. I said there were also reforms relating to sacred space, that is temples. So I'll try and tell you how Malabar region, how was connected with that also, right? The first was in, in the wake of Pune Pact of 1932, September 1932, which is a very well-known episode in our history. Somebody called Kelappan, he issued a notice to the Zamorin of Calicut saying that he wants the temple of Guruvayur to be thrown open, and he threatened that he would go on hunger strike, he would fast against the continuation of those restrictions. And that led to Gandhi intervening and telling Kelappan to call off his fast, and he instead came up with a very odd solution, a solution that shows that Gandhi was trying to be very tactical, was trying to be very diplomatic towards caste Hindus. What he said was, let's not adopt this rights-based approach. Let's not expect caste Hindus to be able to, overnight get rid of this deeply ingrained prejudice that they have against lower castes. That notion that they are pure and those castes below are polluting and therefore have to be kept away from temples and all that, right? So what we will instead do is we'll work in order to appeal to their hearts and heads. We will try and convert them and then conduct a kind of a referendum among the local devotees, and if they are agreeable to opening that particular temple, then we will do so. And he actually carried out through, again, Rajaji in the year 1932, Congress carried out a referendum in Guruvayur. This was Gandhi's model at that time. He wasn't prepared to go the whole distance and say, all temples should be thrown open on the basis of equal rights and all that. The Samadarshi, the name of this organization, Gandhi was not willing to have at that time. That came much later. I'm not going into the history of Gandhi's evolution on the temple entry. I will instead go to another temple entry related issue where Malabar figures very prominently. And that was thanks to something that happened in 1936 in Travancore. What happened in Travancore? Travancore was the first province anywhere in the country, was a princely state rather, anywhere in the country to have thrown open its temples to all castes including untouchables. It's called, very famously, it's called Temple Entry Proclamation. And it was promulgated at the time of Chitira Tirunal. And C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer was supposed to have played a very crucial role in the enactment of that law, right? Now, that inspired some people in British India, and Malabar was part of British India, as I said, right? So, what Rajaji did was, okay, they passed a resolution in the Madras legislature congratulating Chitira Tirunal, and saying that the rest of the country should follow the example of Travancore. And then they also built a statue in honor of Chitira Tirunal. But then, were they prepared to really follow his example? No. All that this man came up with was a compromise. He said, look, I'm hesitant to come up with such a proclamation or such a law in Madras Presidency because I don't know how conservative elements in Madras Presidency will react. So what I will do is, since it was tried in Travancore and with great success, maybe Malayalam speaking people are amenable to this reform. So he says, instead of passing a law for the whole of Madras presidency, I will come up with a law that is confined to the Malabar district. So he actually comes up with a bill that is meant only for Malabar district. And this legislation that he introduces on 1st December 1938, the statement of objects and reasons says this. Its SOR all but admitted that Rajaji was piggybacking on the ruler of a princely state, that is Travancore. It says, by reason of common traditions, this is what the statement of objects and reasons of Rajaji's bill says. By reason of common traditions, identity of language, customs, forms of worship and the like prevailing among the Hindus in the Travancore state and in the district of Malabar, which is part of the Madras presidency, it is considered that the removal of the disabilities aforesaid can be brought about in the first instance more easily in that district. Now, what did members of the untouchable community in the Madras presidency say, those who are in the legislative council? That is very instructive. As I said, the first ever legislator from the untouchable community was MC Raja. He was very much there in the Madras legislature in this particular one. So he says that he recalls that many decades earlier, when Swami Vivekananda was on an all India tour, before he went to US on that historic trip to Chicago, right, addressing the Parliament of Religions, when he happened to come to the Kerala area, he first touched the Malabar area. He was so shocked by what he saw. Why? Because he was accustomed to seeing untouchability. But he was seeing unapproachability for the first time. And that prompted him to call this whole area a lunatic asylum. I mean, he was so taken aback by that, right? So this man, MC Raja, recalls that you are, instead of coming straightforward with a legislation that covers the entire Madras presidency, you choose of all the places a district that was a few decades ago called in that very derisive manner by none other than Swami Vivekananda. And he says, I wonder if Malabar, this is what Raja said, I wonder if Malabar has outgrown the times in which that description was made. Raja asked Rajaji why he had selected, now these are his quotes, a rocky place to sow his seed. I mean, that seed of reform, of allowing untouchables to enter temples. Should you have chosen a place like Malabar, which was considered so terrible not too long ago by Vivekananda, right? So you can imagine how there were all these very fascinating, very instructive legislative debates that took place in and around the place where we are speaking from, So I don't know how much time I have. Sorry, you will inform me. Okay. So now let me then tell you, these are the kind of battles, legislative and judicial, that I dealt with in my book, and many of this by default are coming out for the first time. Why do I say by default? Because these records from the legislature, what I was reading out now, I gave you an extract of that, right? So such legislative records are all there in the archives, and judicial records are also there in the archives, and archives are typically visited by academics, by historians, sociologists, and there's no dearth of literature on caste. You have countless number of books, yet on these legal aspects of caste, little or nothing was done by academics. How did I discover this? It happened this way. As Mr. Jose mentioned, this is actually my third book. My earlier books, I represent a confluence of law and journalism because I'm a law graduate and I worked as a journalist, and therefore I focused on legal, human rights and social justice issues. So my first book was on the carnage targeting Sikhs in 1984 in Delhi. There was so much of a cover-up of that episode that the inquiry, judicial inquiry that was conducted in a very hush-hush manner, in a very secretive manner, resulted in a clean chit, as we say, exonerating the political leadership, the administrative leadership, the police, on whose watch such a huge massacre, such a huge pogrom took place right in the capital of the country. Pogrom targeting Sikhs, right? This was in the wake of Indira Gandhi's assassination. And to begin with, there was such, the government was so much in denial that they used to, bandy some very small figures of as death toll. But certain years later, in 87 or so, when very reluctantly it was forced to do a proper tally of the deaths, it came up with a death toll of 2,733. I repeat, 2,733 people were killed, Sikhs were killed in the capital of the country in a matter of 3 days, right? So, now, my book was titled When a Tree Shook Delhi, the 1984 carnage and its aftermath. You may recall that Rajiv Gandhi very infamously said, as a justification for the violence that followed, he said, when a big tree falls, the earth is bound to shake. So my book was inspired by that very brazen justification offered by Rajiv Gandhi in his first public meeting as Prime Minister from Boat Club, very close to India Gate. Right? And then in 2002, you saw what happened in Gujarat. So I came up with a book on the 2002 violence, especially after the then Chief Minister of Gujarat, Narendra Modi, was exonerated by a special investigation team set up by the Supreme Court. Now, like in the case of the Gujarat book, like in the case of the Delhi book, I essentially focused on official legal documentation because that would be hard for the other side to deny. So here what I did was I focused on, for instance, the SIT report that exonerated Modi and others who were in the Gujarat administration at the time. So I brought out the contradiction between, the internal contradiction, the contradiction between the evidence they recorded and the conclusions they arrived at. So it was something that they could not say is unreliable, because it's not as if I quoted some activist or some victim to counter what is there in that book. I was spitting their own evidence against their conclusion, right? So that's why I called that book The Fiction of Fact-Finding, Modi and Godra. Now, the third book I wanted to do was by way of a trilogy on mass violence. Because I did 2 books relating to communal violence, I thought this time I will do a book on the recurring incidents of caste violence targeting untouchables in different parts of the country. And in the course of my career as a journalist, I had occasion to deal with or report on several such incidents that took place in places like Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Maharashtra and elsewhere, right? Or Tamil Nadu. And when I started looking at each of those instances for the purpose of my book, when I was doing a deep dive into those cases, what I found was that again and again I was running into this pattern of some arm or the other of the Indian state, be it the police, the prosecuting agency, the trial court or the appellate court, exonerating the culprits on the flimsiest of grounds. So I could see that what was evident was some kind of a systemic bias, a structural bias. So I wanted to know where this was coming from, why there was this gap between the rhetoric and reality of the rule of law, of social justice. So that prompted me to look up some of the existing literature on the subject, and to my surprise I found that the legal aspects of caste were given a short shrift. I mean, they did not get the attention they deserved from the existing literature. So that made me go to the archives myself and dig out all these primary sources. And one thing led to another. I found myself unearthing a wealth of unexplored legislative and judicial debates going back 200 years. You know, whatever else might have been the problem with the colonial rule, they were very good at one thing, and that was they were very good at recording, proceedings. So everything was very meticulously recorded, and it was a material that was waiting to be written about, especially because it is so relevant to today's fault lines. So there were things like this, that took place, which never got the attention they deserve. So that helps us understand why, although we enacted all sorts of laws since the British period, when it comes to implementation, why is there so much tardiness, so much unwillingness? Why, despite all the evidence that is there, there's so much of impunity? So I then went into various aspects of these battles. They not all relate to untouchability. Different aspects. Like for instance, there is one whole chapter in my book on intercaste marriage. Now this is a subject that concerns Hindus across the board, right? And it was in the year 1918 that someone called Vithalbhai Patel, who is the elder brother of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, he introduced this bill which sought to legalize intercaste marriage and confer legitimacy on the children of intercaste marriage. Why did he come up with such a bill? Because, because of our traditional notions of purity and impurity and so on and so forth, such inter-varna or inter-jati or inter-caste marriages were all prohibited and not recognized. So he said, look, it's against nature. There were lots of marriages in our huge country. For various reasons, they still take place despite such prohibitions. And you have to take a liberal view of it. And he tactically cites examples where Brahmin women happen to marry, people from lower caste. There were two kinds of intercaste marriage. One is anulom and the other is pratilom. Both were forbidden, but pratilom was more forbidden than anulom. Why? Because anulom was about marriages that an upper caste man undertakes with a lower caste woman. So that was forbidden, but it was still something that they could tolerate. But when it came to pratilom, something like Manu Smriti says that this is so bad that the children of pratilom marriages would be chandals. Chandals means that they would be unfit for human interaction. They are fit only to work in cremation grounds. So what is pratilom? Pratilom is where an upper caste woman, say a Brahmin woman, marries somebody from a Shudra community, or worse, an Ati Shudra community, that is Avarna. The four Varnas, they were called Savarna Jatis, and then you had these Avarna Jatis. So if you had any such marriages, because women were considered vehicles of, for preserving the purity of that lineage, they had that patriarchal notion of women being their property, much like how these days there's this talk about, love jihad, a term that was supposed to have been coined, unfortunately, in Kerala, right? So when it comes to a marriage with a Hindu woman, then these right-wingers, Hindu right-wingers take great offense to it. Then they would say, this is a result of a criminal conspiracy to overtake India and all that, right? So they're more sensitive to that. Similarly, our Brahmins and other such caste Hindus were also very sensitive to women from their communities marrying lower caste men. So that was called pratilom. Now, who were the people who opposed this bill that Vittal Bhai Patel introduced? The Hindu right of the time. Who were they? Remember, this was 1918. 1918 means that it was not yet the Hindu right that we are accustomed to seeing today. Why? Because RSS came into existence only in 1925. This was a time when Hindu Mahasabha was in existence, but it was still in a very, nascent stage. It was still largely in provinces. And Hindu Mahasabha was working in tandem with Congress at the time. And so the Hindu right was essentially within the Congress tent, the big tent of Congress. So the man who really opposed this intercaste marriage bill was none other than somebody who is still the champion of today's Hindu right. That is Madan Mohan Malviya. You may know that he had by then, in 1915-16, he was already instrumental in setting up that Banaras Hindu University. Right? He was very powerful, very popular leader at the time. And yet he thought it fit to oppose something that you would today take for granted. What is wrong with intercaste marriage? Today even the Hindu right would say, yes, it is good. At least in theory they would say it is good because they want to unify Hindus. They want to say that they are all one community. There's no... So, yet at that time, they were so opposed to it. So, and that was Malviya, who you may recall that in 2014, when Modi came to power, the first ever Bharat Ratna he gave. I mean, this year we've had a string of Bharat Ratnas, right? The first Bharat Ratna Modi gave was to who? Was to Madan Mohan Malviya. Why? Because Modi had contested from Malviya's territory, that is Varanasi. He had in fact started his campaign after garlanding Malviya's statue in front of BHU, Banaras Hindu University. So he is still very much the hero of today's Hindu right. Now that man, what did he say in 1918? He said this is something unacceptable, and his arguments smacked of what we call very commonly as Hindu khatre mein hai, which means Hindus are in danger if something like this happens. If something like what happens? If intercaste marriages are allowed to take place between Hindus themselves. We are not even talking about interfaith marriage. We are talking about marriages within that same community. And that was so objectionable to him. And he was supported by another prominent Congress leader, Surendranath Banerjee. Both these were at different times, more than once, presidents of Congress party. And Malviya also went on to become president of Hindu Mahasabha. So this was the state of affairs. So seeing the hostility to this legislation, to this bill, the British said, the British administration did not back it. So it was dropped at that time. And there were several attempts that were made for the next few years. In fact, that battle went on for over 3 decades. And finally in 1949, when a legislator from Haryana, from today's Haryana, at that time it was Punjab, Thakurdas Bhargava, a Brahmin incidentally, he introduced the same kind of bill that Patel had introduced in 1918, and this was the 4th or 5th attempt by then, and this was post-independence. Now suddenly all those concerns about Hindus being in danger on account of intercaste marriage, all those orthodox objections, concerns, they all evaporated into thin air. Why? Because the political situation had changed. The colonial rule had ended. This was post-independence, and anybody who continues to oppose it openly would be exposed. And it would also show that if this reform had not been passed for so many years, although the attempts were being made since 1918, it was not because the British administration was coming in the way. It was because conservative elements from within the Hindu community were opposing it, right? So suddenly the same bill that was so vehemently opposed for so many decades, in 1949 it was passed unanimously, right? So now that doesn't mean that there was a change of heart. How do I say so? Because even after so many decades have passed, since the enactment of the 1949 law, this endogamy is still the norm. Endogamy is central to the caste system, which is that you marry within your caste, right? So a recent survey showed that although we might all anecdotally come across a lot of instances of intercaste marriage, if you take the totality into account, it's only about 5% or so that have resorted to intercaste marriage. And even, quite apart from that very revealing statistic, you should bear in mind that even in the 21st century, even after so much has happened, when intercaste marriages take place in a place like Tamil Nadu, and if I'm not mistaken, even in Kerala, there are instances where it led to what is known as honor killings. Honor killings means what? It means the parents of that runaway couple are so seized of that casteist madness that they kill their own children. It's as real as that. And that happens even in this day and age. Despite all the other signs of so-called modernity and all that, right? So this is what I deal with in my book. Originally, as I said, my intention was only to focus on violence, but ultimately I widened the ambit. It became so ambitious, and I didn't want to let go of it. I allowed evidence to take me wherever it did. It cost me a lot. I gave up my job. Fortunately, I got a couple of fellowships that sustained me. I had a supportive wife, so I managed to keep it going. It took 7 years, and the result is that there is this fat book which comes up with a lot of new material, and which is very revealing, which is very relevant to today's context, and it has 18 chapters. Only the last 2 chapters deal with violence. So you can imagine how the ambit of the book widened way beyond what I originally set out to do. And let me add that I am not done with it yet. There was so much new material that although this book is so fat, it has over 600 pages, this was not enough for me to cover all the material that I unearthed. There are many topics that I could not deal with. Some of them are hot button issues like, say, reservations, or even this violence engendered by intercaste marriage. I can go on. Child marriage, all these aspects, they all have some bearing or the other on widow remarriage. They're all related in different ways. 5 minutes or I'm done with the time altogether. I did ask you to warn me 5 minutes in advance. Okay, I'll finish. So I just want to say that I'm currently working on another volume, and that will be covering topics that are not covered in this book, and that's a measure of how much this very important aspect, the legal aspects of caste, intersection of law and caste, was neglected. And if I had attempted a similar book on, say, the intersection of law and race in US, I would have struggled to find anything new to say, because that intersection of law and race has been so thoroughly researched and written about by American scholars, and it is part of their school textbooks. But when it comes to the intersection of law and caste, so little is known, or so little has been explored, that an outsider like me, a mere journalist, he could come up with so much new material. So because of that, I will be dealing with, coming up with another volume, hopefully in the next year or two. So thank you very much for your patience.